the training, we should have around 25 attendees, which is awesome. But that way we make sure we can continue chatting and not be disrupted by other people's voices. So that's first. And then additionally, if you do have questions throughout the course of the training, we'd just ask that you pop those in the chat. I will be kind of monitoring that throughout the if you can leave your questions in the chat, I will be monitoring that, and we will leave some time at the end of our session for questions. So yeah, just keep yourself muted for the course of the training. With that, I'd like to first introduce myself. My name is Megan Heber. I'm the Placemaking and Environmental Review Manager for IHCDA. Sam Spur will normally be with us. Many of you know Sam and have worked with her in the past. She is actually in another training right now for one of her other many duties going on here at the agency. So she says hi to everyone, and she should be able to join us for our next summer training session in August. With that, I'm going to actually turn it over to our awesome third-party team, SJCA. We have Karen, Heather, and Amy with us. Many of you have also worked with them on the environmental review process over the years, and they've graciously given us their afternoon to go over the historic preservation Section 106 process in more detail, as we know this can kind of be a complicated process to undertake. So I'm going to turn it over, I think, to Heather, and she's going to kind of start going through our slides. And like I said, if you have any questions, please just drop those in the chat and we'll get to them at the end of the session. We're planning this to be about an hour and then about 30 minutes at the end for questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Heather.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Heather. I'm pretty sure I've interacted with a couple of you before while completing these environmental reviews. I'm the gremlin that affects the process for you all. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my camera so that we can focus on the presentation. And with that being done, we're going to get started. So, as Megan said, what we're going to be covering today is the historic preservation part of the environmental review process. And so we have our opening meeting agenda. Of course, we're going to go through the basics, the what, why, who, and when. Why is this done? What do you need to complete? Who are the people you are going to be contacting? We're then going to do a brief discussion of the Indiana SHPO review process, when and why that is needed, how to complete archaeology if that becomes something that needs to be done in order to work on the site you selected, and any potential project impacts. So to begin, we're going to start with a brief discussion of historic preservation. Now, this is part of the environmental review, in part thanks to the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. So this was created at a time when the U.S. government realized that many of the significant historic and archaeological resources of the United States were at risk of destruction due to rapid construction, urbanization, and of course, the development of transportation networks like highways and increased roadways for cars. Now, this process is called the Section 106 review and has its own guiding regulations. These are done in conjunction with the environmental review, which is why when you submit an application to IHCDA, you're going to see both questions asking about the environmental conditions of the site and also about any potential historic resources nearby. Now, there are going to be multiple components that you will have to undergo. If your project is a new construction, it will have a 30-day archaeological review with the State Historic Preservation Office. And what they are going to do is determine whether or not an archaeological report needs to be completed. You will also need to include Department of Natural Resource historic maps that will show if a site is of historic relevance in a historic district or is ranked as notable or outstanding. You will also need to provide a scope of work, site photos in the cardinal directions, and your building plans. It's important to label these, as we will not always know what we are looking at when we're looking solely at the plans and the photos, and you want to make sure that these are recent. You don't want to be pulling these from Google Maps or from any kind of website like that. It's best if you've actually gone out and taken the photos yourself. Finally, there's going to be consulting party letters, and this is the part where applicants tend to get confused. As part of the Section 106 process, you will be required to consult with outside parties and provide any responses that you receive. Now, these outside parties are typically either Indiana landmarks, local city or county historical societies, any historic district community organizations, or county historians. If you are a local unit of government, you will be allowed to contact the tribes. However, the majority of you are not local units of governments. These are usually the cities, so IHCDA will be contacting the tribes on your behalf. If that is the case, you just need to provide us with a Word document of those letters that you wish to send out. Based on the information that you give us, we will be able to determine if there is no historic properties affected. This means there's no significant resources and it's not in a historic district. No adverse effect, which means your scope of work isn't going to impact the historic nature of existing historic resources. Or adverse effect, which is a resource is going to be impacted. I would like to state here that if you do get adverse effect, this does not mean that your project is dead in the water. What it means is that we are going to have to move into the mitigation process, which will be discussed later. And then finally, this is something that I discussed earlier. Tribal consultation is required if the construction of homes or excavation will result in ground disturbing activities. This will typically be completed by IHCDA itself unless you happen to work for a unit of government like the city of Indianapolis. If you're not sure, that is something you could definitely ask us as part of the environmental review. However, if you're working for a nonprofit or for-profit, there is a good chance you're not a unit of government. Here I'm going to pass it to Karen and Megan, as I'm afraid I have not worked with the development fund often. Would either one of you like to step in for a second?
Yeah, sure thing. So for those of you who've worked with us in the past and have received development fund as a part of your application, SHPO requires that there are two separate processes. So Heather, Karen, and Amy covered the federal historic preservation piece with the Section 106 process. A development fund has its own state approval process, and that's called the Certificate of Approval. So we just wanted to put an extra slide here letting you know that if for some reason you are utilizing development fund, previously in the past, I think we had mentioned if it was standalone, not paired with home, but even if it's paired with home, oftentimes they want us to still do this. So if you are in a national register, or if your site is a national register site, or you are in a historic district, we will have to do what's called a certificate of approval request to SHPO. It's just an application explaining what's happening on the property, what the scope of work is going to be, and we submit that to them. They have 30 days to review that and give us approval. If for some reason they have further concerns past those 30 days, then we have to take your project to the quarterly historic preservation review board. Like I said, this happens quarterly. This doesn't happen very often, but when it does, we do have to wait for that board meeting. So I believe it's January, April, October, or maybe September, and then the end of the year. So we do have to wait for that review board meeting to come up and present. I have yet to have a project that has not at least gone, even if it's gone to the board, been passed, but we just want to let you know to prepare in advance if you're using development fund and you're specific, most usually in a historic district, you're probably going to have to walk through this process. I prepare their certificate of approval for you, but usually I'm going to need scope of work from you and a lot of other details just so that I can accurately describe what's going on the project to SHPO. So that's just little bit of background. If you have further questions about that, you can save those for the end or just send me an email, and we can talk through that also.
All right, thank you very much. All right, now we're going to discuss the Indiana SHPO review process. Like I mentioned earlier, SHPO stands for the State Historic Preservation Officer, and they will be reviewing your projects. So as we mentioned before, if your project is a new construction, it will require the 30-day Indiana SHPO review to determine if there's any potential for archaeological resources in the area. In this case, new construction refers to the building of any new structure. So if you're doing rehabilitation, that isn't going to count. And I've included a couple examples of what ground disturbance will include. Any project that has ground disturbance will also qualify for the archaeological review. This can mean if you have to dig for foundations, if you have to do plumbing work, if you have a pre-existing building, but you intend to add an addition or build behind it, that will also qualify. And we are going to need the following items for you in order to do the submission to SHPO. We, as the environmental reviewer, will submit to SHPO for you. You do not have to interact with SHPO, but we do need to have your environmental workbook completed to prevent delays in the project timeline. So what we send to them is going to be a completed Exhibit A from your workbook, a completed 3-5 Section 106 Historic Properties Review from the workbook, an aerial map that has your project area clearly outlined, an aerial map on the Indiana Historic Buildings, Bridges, and Cemeteries map with a APE, which stands for an area of potential effect. I'm going to go into more detail about that in the next couple of slides. You're going to need a soil map that once again has your project area outlined, and we're going to need your site photos and your site plans. In addition to this information, we as your environmental reviewer will also submit to SHPO historic aerial maps that we've pulled of your project site and Sanborn maps. And these just help speed up the review process and make sure that SHPO is getting all of the information. Our archaeologists have also provided a lovely photo of some of the items you can potentially find while doing an archaeological review. It's a lot of pottery. Okay. We're going to get into something that's a little more complex now. This is something that people have often struggled with when submitting their environmental workbook to us, and that is putting their project area on the IHBBC map. So this is what it's going to look like. There is a mapping tool that you can use, and I've included the link to it in the slides. And you're going to see multiple things on this map. If you look at the legend at the bottom, you'll see that the large teal area is what is considered a National Register Historic District. This is a large area that has been determined to have historic significance and has multiple properties in it. Districts are usually some of the most likely that will have adverse effect if you are doing construction within one and might end up having mitigation. You will also see multiple colored dots. Section 106 divides properties into multiple categories of significance. The lowest would be a blue dot, which is when a property is rated non-contributing but is still included within a historic district. You will see purple, which is the next most common, and these are contributing properties that don't really reach a level of significance that would require mitigation, but are still considered valuable to the cultural landscape of a community. And then you'll see green for notable and red for outstanding. These are much more significant and often have architectural elements that will require preservation. When I open up the legend, you're also going to see gold stars. As the symbol might indicate, these are the gold stars of the historical world, and these are properties that people really want to keep preserved. This red square that you see is going to be how your project area is represented on a map. The project area will typically encompass the entire property parcel or your construction zone, and you want to make sure you're mapping that out correctly. The yellow is going to be your area of potential effect. This is often kind of difficult to draw if you don't have any experience with it. In general, we want your APE to include at least the surrounding properties because you want to take into account any visual and auditory effects that will come about as a result of construction. It's kind of like if you have a construction site right next to your home, that would be part of the potential effect because you're hearing that noise all the time and the view shed of your property is going to change. With that, I'm going to go ahead and open the tool. I've linked it and I've also opened it over here for ease of access. This big, somewhat confusing looking map is the DHPA Indiana Historic Buildings, Bridges, and Cemeteries map. When you open this, in order to make your own map, you first want to turn off this layer in the background. If you go to the upper right part of the map, you'll see the layer list. And this will have the many different layers that are currently open. We're going to go ahead and turn off the topo map and instead turn on the available imagery. And this will give you the aerial view that we need. You're then going to find your property. You might have to do this manually, or if you know that the property you're working with is a historical site, you'll be able to put in the address or location up here. So we'll zoom in and do a sample. And it might take a couple minutes to load. I don't know if many of you have worked with GIS, which is the mapping software in which this was built. It combines a lot of different data layers, and sometimes it can take a minute for them to load in properly. I was really hoping this would work today. It was not quite working earlier. All right, while that is loading, I'll talk you through the next steps. So we're going to pretend that this property here on Leslie Avenue is our property that we intend to use for a project. You want to make sure that you have your screen centered on it, and you want to make sure that these layers have loaded in. Once you've done that, you can actually just go over here to the print button. Oh dear. I'm sorry, guys. This doesn't happen often, but occasionally when one of the layers is being worked on, the map will go a little wonky. So what you will typically do is you will print, and the first option that's going to appear is print to PDF. And what this does is it makes a PDF of the map, and it will incorporate the legend over here. You want to make sure that when you're printing to PDF, you have this legend included because it'll explain what all of the symbols on the map mean. Once you have done this, the easiest way to modify the map and draw in your project area is just to open up the recently PDF document into any of your software like Adobe and just draw in the squares yourself. And normally, oh man, I'm sorry this isn't working today. Normally it isn't this complicated. But if you guys do have any questions with making these maps, please feel free to contact us as your environmental reviewers. Me, Amy, and Karen work with this software all the time and have a much easier time of navigating it and are always willing to either send an email or jump into a quick call to ensure it's working properly and that you're showing stuff effectively. Oh dear, I've lost my slideshow. There we go. And then as a final note, when you're drawing your APE, please do not deliberately try to leave out historic properties and districts. SHPO will know, and they do not appreciate when people do that. So if you do see a historic district within your potential APE, don't be afraid to draw it out. It just means we're going to have to work with you a little more to keep the project moving forward. All right, so once we get all of that submitted to IHCDA, there is a chance that you will be asked to complete an archaeological review. These do not happen often, but when they do, it means that your site has been identified as potentially containing archaeological resources. When this happens, Indiana SHPO will send us as SJCA a letter and an email indicating archaeology is required. We will forward these to you, and then we can begin the archaeology process. Your first step is going to be to hire a qualified professional archaeologist. This isn't just a title. To be a qualified professional in Indiana means that you have met the state's requirements in order to receive that title. Included in the slides is going to be a list of all of the people who've attained this title. And this is what that is going to look like. They've recently updated this to incorporate both archaeologists and architectural historians, but you're just going to want to stick to the archaeologists. They're going to have company names, they're going to have people you can contact, and the document is quite long and in-depth. If you're unsure of who to contact after looking at it, we can include a couple of recommendations. In particular, we tend to recommend the ASC group, Cultural Resource Analysts, or Metric Environmental, because that is who we have a good working relationship with. However, if you're unsure, it is okay to call around and ask for a couple of quotes. You might be able to find an archaeologist in your area who already knows the location and will be able to go out there easily, and it will depend on workload. Your chosen archaeologist is going to complete a Phase 1A archaeology report for you. When you receive this report, you need to request that the archaeologist upload it to something called SHARD, and this is the State Historic Archaeology and Archaeological Resources Database. You then need to let us know that they have uploaded it, and be sure to attach a copy of the report and a copy of the SHARD submittal acknowledgement document. This is going to have the number that we need to include in our new submittal to SHPO. Once we have this, we will submit all of this information to SHPO again, and they will begin a 30-day review of the archaeology report. All right, and with that, we're going to give you a bit of an example of a project that did have to have archaeology, why it was required, and what your prospective timeline can look like. In this case, the project was Landon Point. It was a new construction project that wanted to use home funds to build 50 townhouse units, including driveways and sidewalks. You can see on the upper right part of the slide the project site that they had outlined and their area of potential effect that they conveniently drew. Now, there were no structures on the site in the past. Instead, it had been an orchard. And unfortunately, any property that only has been used for agriculture in the past does not count as previously disturbed. Only sites that have had actual construction, such as housing, are considered previously disturbed. After the SHPO review, it was determined that archaeology was required because the location met the standards as having potential archaeological resources. I'm going to give you the definition for that. And this is something you want to consider when looking at your project area, if archaeology might be required. Excuse me, one moment. My asthma is acting up today. All right. An area is considered suitable for archaeological resources if it is rural or suburban with no prior development and no potential records of previous archaeological finds. If a site has only been partially reviewed by an archaeologist in the past, it will require another archaeological review. Unfortunately, you will not have access to the archaeological database. This is why it needs to go to SHPO. Only qualified professionals are able to access the database and determine whether or not a review has been done on the area. And part of this is because, unfortunately, when you let the public know about potential archaeological resources, it unfortunately invites sometimes the worst kinds of people who will go out and go digging looking for artifacts, and that's not what you want. So when you do require archaeology, you want to consider how this might affect your timeline. In this case, the first review was sent to SHPO on February 14th. We received a response on February 22nd. The applicant submitted their archaeology again on March 15th, and they received a response on March 27th. I'd like to point out that this was a quick turnaround time for SHPO. You need to remember that they are allowed to take 30 calendar days for each review. So archaeology can sometimes take an additional 8 to 10 weeks to complete, or roughly 2 to 3 months. And this depends on how quickly you are able to find an archaeologist and get them to complete the review so that we can get it submitted to SHPO. So if you think that you might have to do archaeology, it is all right to hire an archaeologist first and keep them on staff, or to even complete an archaeology report before you submit your project. But you want to take into consideration the additional cost that can incur. And in addition, focus on how the potential for archaeology can impact the timeline of your project. All right, so let's say you've done section 106, you've done your SHPO review, and you've done your archaeology. After that, there is a potential to have a project impact. And what this means is your project has been found to meet the criteria of adverse effect. Once again, I would like to state that if you do have a situation where your project will have an adverse effect on a historic or archaeological resource, this does not mean your project is dead. It just means that now you, IHCDA, and SHPO will have to focus on mitigating those effects as best as possible to ensure that the resources can maintain their integrity and you can get your housing built. So if you do uncover archaeological resources, we will continue to correspond with SHPO to determine if those resources are considered potentially eligible for either preservation or for one of the registers. If you have reached this step, you will need to complete section 354 of the environmental review workbook. This is towards the end and it's only done in the meeting the criteria of adverse effect. If there is that adverse effect, we will all work together with the consulting parties that you invited earlier to determine the appropriate methods of mitigation. One of the most common forms of mitigation that we end up creating is called the Memorandum of Agreement, and these are signed between IHCDA and the Indiana State Historic Preservation Office. These MOAs will determine the stipulations to the construction of your housing development to ensure that all historic and archaeological resources have their potential effects mitigated. In this case, mitigation usually just means the minimization of effect. So instead of, for instance, tearing down an old building, you might try to instead modify it or construct it to make it meet modern standards while still preserving significant historic elements. So some examples of mitigation, once again, the preservation of historic architectural elements. If you have a building that has historic windows and wooden frame or a wooden trim that is considered architectural significant, we might try to preserve that while still making sure you're meeting your housing standards. We might work with the community to post interpretive signage that explains the history of the area so that people know what was once there and why it was important. And we might preserve artifacts discovered during construction. This handy photo that I've included here was provided by our archaeologists. And what it is actually an urban roasting pit that was discovered in a suburb. And so this collection of stones is where people used to roast their meat. And that is something that might want to be preserved. And then again, we're going to give you a bit of an example. This was a recent project that we had to sign an MOA for called the Downtown Sullivan Townhomes. And what they intended to do was create multiple townhomes, but for one of them, they were going to have to demolish a building that was within a pre-existing historic district. It was considered a contributing property and thus was essential for maintaining the historic character and significance of the area. Many of the historic districts that you're going to encounter if you're building in urban or suburban areas might be commercial districts or older neighborhoods that have kind of fallen into disuse. And they often feature important architectural developments as well as showcase the development of the town, which is why people often want to preserve them. In this case, IHCDA, IHCPO, and the consulting parties worked together to come up with an agreement that worked for everyone to help preserve not only the cultural significance of the area, but also facilitated the development of housing. In this case, they were going to document the buildings before demolition, and so taking photos, making sure everyone knew what it looked like before it was removed. They included a commitment to meaningful design review. This means that they brought in the consulting parties to talk about how they're going to design the front facade of the house. In this case, this means that they were just focusing on what elements they could maintain on the exterior. The consulting parties did not have a say about the actual internal construction. They're going to post interpretive signage, and they're going to pursue a National Register nomination of a previously identified historic district that was within the APE and within the area that they were going to build. Altogether, creating a memorandum of agreement can take between 3 to 5 months, and once again can stretch a project out, but does not mean that your project has to stop. It just means that we're all going to have to work together to ensure that these resources are being preserved while still allowing you to build your housing developments. And it is also important to consider that all MOAs are going to be different based on the needs of the site in question. Unfortunately, these aren't a one-size-fits-all, so you will have to work closely with the parties you invited, IHCDA, and IHCPO to make sure you're meeting everybody's needs. With that, we can direct you to some further training and IHCDA resources. The HUD Exchange has a very good resources on how to get through the environmental review process and the related laws and authorities that are going to be implemented while carrying out this process. And you'll also be able to find a variety of other resources, including the Section 106 User's Guide, the Workbook, Resources Guide, and a funds layering flowchart.